Hi everyone, famous YouTuber Skitty Bitty here. For a while now, I've wanted to make a video about the portrayal of the Gerudo in the Zelda series. I love to examine, criticize, and interrogate works of art that are important to me, and the Zelda games are no exception. I find the Gerudo fascinating, and I've discussed them a little bit here and there on stream before, but there hasn't felt like a right time to talk about them at length. So why am I talking about them now? Well, it all started on Twitter. This is going to be a mostly serious video on a serious topic, but unfortunately we need to briefly talk about some internet drama for a couple minutes just so we're all on the same page. So, a friend of mine sent me this Tumblr post complaining about the lack of substantial fan content for the Wild era games, specifically mentioning people mischaracterizing Zelda and obsessing over Link's quote-unquote racist-ass Gerudo outfit. The post concludes with the tag, "The consequences of that f***ass Skitty Bitty video essay." I was confused by this, so I reposted it to Twitter and said, "This is such a weird post to catch a stray on, because this person has clearly never seen any of my work. Like, me, famous Gerudo Orientalism hater Skitty Bitty, famous Princess Zelda defender Skitty Bitty, famous good take haver Skitty Bitty, bizarre." This tweet wasn't about the Gerudo, it was about someone's weird misdirected frustration towards me, but that wasn't enough to dissuade small creator and perpetual reply guy Octorok Reviews from hopping on the post to voice his concerns.
You hate the Gerudo? I think they're fantastic additions to Ocarina storytelling precisely because they're meant to be this tragic other that got dealt a bad hand in life. They're products of their environment, not inherently evil. Now, Breath of the Wild Gerudo is another matter.
This led to a brief back and forth that I'll put up on screen for people who are curious, but it didn't really go anywhere productive, the fate of all Twitter arguments. Eventually I stopped replying, and I figured that was the end of it. I was wrong. 10 days later, Octorok Reviews released In Defense of the Gerudo, a nearly 30-minute long video that, while never mentioning me by name, shows screenshots of my tweets and was clearly prompted by our little exchange. So, to recap, I made an offhand comment as part of a completely unrelated post. This guy showed up in my mentions accusing me of hating the Gerudo, and now he's parlayed the argument that followed into a 27-minute long video defending them. The bad news is that he doesn't seem to understand what people are actually talking about when they criticize the Gerudo, especially their portrayal in Ocarina of Time. But the good news is that now I have an excuse to talk about a topic I think is really interesting. So this video is a response to Octorok Reviews, but it's also about the Gerudo, Orientalism in the Zelda series, and what I think can be done to remedy some of the issues with them going forward. Spoiler alert, the answer isn't to remove or retcon them from the game. Speaking of which, the biggest problem with Octo's argument is that it's predicated on a misrepresentation of what I actually believe. Throughout his video, he claims repeatedly that some sinister group of performative Zelda fans is advocating for the Gerudo to be removed from the series.
So color me surprised when I learned that certain parts of the fandom not only don't like the Gerudo, but actively campaign for the removal or complete retcon of their culture and storytelling, and thus advocate for the removal from the series, and why this accusation of them being Orientalist is ultimately surface level and not a convincing argument as to why they should be removed or retconned from the series. Not only would they seek to remove a vital part of Hyrule's world building from the canon simply to satisfy their own need to fight against self-perceived Orientalist prejudice.
This is the crux of his entire video. It's right there in the title, In Defense of the Gerudo. What is his evidence that people want to see the Gerudo removed from the Zelda series? Well, he doesn't have any. No articles, no blog posts, not even a tweet. His source for the claim that underpins this entire video is literally just, "Trust me, bro." My favorite part is when he claims,
"I realized that this faulty perspective was a lot more widespread than first thought."
He says this while showing a screenshot of one of my tweets that has 6 likes on it. And the tweet on screen isn't even saying the Gerudo should be removed from the Zelda series. He's not showing the tweet where I say that because it doesn't exist, because I don't think that. There was never any discussion of removing or retconning the Gerudo out of the Zelda series at any point, so what is this actually about? What is the point of this video? In Defense of the Gerudo honestly feels like some sort of temporal anomaly. Hand-wringing about politically motivated fake fans who want to censor your video games is so 10 years ago. I was under the impression that serious people broadly accepted that video games, like any art form, are sometimes subject to critical analysis through socio-political lenses. It's been like this for decades. One of the articles I read for this video that argued the importance of studying video games through the lenses of race and gender was published in 2006. This isn't some current-day culture war nonsense, but I suppose everything feels new if you haven't been paying attention. Just to clarify what I actually believe, yes, I do think the depiction of the Gerudo in the Zelda series is leaning hard on Orientalist tropes. I think that's especially true of their appearance in Ocarina of Time. I still love the Zelda series, and I don't think Nintendo did this out of some conscious will to do harm. I don't think the developers of these games are evil racist monsters, and I don't think the solution here is to write the Gerudo out of the canon and pretend pretend they never existed. I do think there are respectful ways for fantasy writers and designers to borrow from real-life cultures, and we'll talk about that later in this video, but the Gerudo have historically fallen short in this regard. They've changed a lot over the years, mostly for the better, but there are still some issues that are worth criticizing. There's nothing wrong with enjoying a story or game that has problematic aspects, and there's also nothing wrong with highlighting or interrogating those aspects. When people discuss these sorts of things, it's almost always an expression of love and care. You'd think someone who makes hours-long videos dissecting and criticizing Zelda games while still loving Zelda games would be able to understand that, but I guess not. Disclaimer: do not harass Octorok reviews. That behavior is never acceptable and will not be tolerated. I think his video is bad and disingenuous, but that's why I'm making this one. No further action on your part is needed. Thank you for your cooperation. So, okay, Octo's video is framed dishonestly, but what about the actual content of his argument, his defense of the Gerudo? He says,
I want to actually engage with the other side on this issue.
What does that look like? Is he at least making a good case for his position? Well, no. Before we proceed, I think it's important to define the word at the heart of this discussion, Orientalism. Actually, before we do that, let's ask an even more basic question. What is the Orient? The English word Orient comes from the Latin word oriens, which means east, so the Orient is the east. Got it. Follow-up question, east of where? Well, east of Europe, specifically Asia and parts of North Africa, but that's ultimately arbitrary. The Earth is round. You could theoretically draw a line dividing east from west anywhere you like. But of course, when you colonize the world, when you draw the maps, everything gets to revolve around you. So that's the Orient. What about Orientalism? It's impossible to discuss Orientalism without discussing the work of Palestinian-American author Edward Said, whose 1978 book, Orientalism, reshaped how countless people, from well-respected academics to third-rate video essayists like myself, understand the East as a Western construct. Orientalism, the book, can be a dense and difficult text, and if I spend too long talking about theory, nobody's going to sit through this video, but this is essential to understand, so please just bear with me for a minute. I promise we'll talk about Zelda soon. And if you pay attention, you might even be able to see where I'm going with all this. Okay, so when Said talks about Orientalism, he's talking about multiple different things that he considers to be interdependent. For the purpose of this video, we're going to focus on the three definitions that he lays out in the book's introduction. The first is the academic definition. Before the publication of this book, Orientalism referred to the Western study of the Orient, or what you might recognize today as Asian or Middle Eastern studies. Though even at the time of writing, the term had kind of fallen out of use, both because of its association with late 19th and early 20th century colonialism, and also because it's too vague a term to actually be useful. As Octo himself points out,
Asia's a big place.
The second definition of Orientalism is, quote, a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient, and most of the time, the Occident. In other words, Orientalism is the idea that there's some fundamental distinction to be made between the East and the West. Said's third definition of Orientalism is as follows, quote again, Orientalism can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it, by teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. Basically, Orientalism is a system that invents the East as a concept so that it can be described, understood, and dominated by the West. Putting these definitions together, Orientalism can be most easily explained in three steps. Step 1. Divide the world into the West and the East, with the starting assumption that the West is, as Said puts it, rational, peaceful, liberal, logical, capable of holding real values without natural suspicion, and that the East is none of those things. Step 2. Study the East so that you can represent the East. What's important here is that you never even consider the possibility of Eastern people representing themselves. And finally, step 3. Use your representation of the East as justification for conquering it. That's still three whole things to keep track of, so let's make it even simpler. Orientalism is a way of representing the East as something fundamentally exotic, but ultimately knowable from the outside. The Orientalist worldview flattens hundreds of diverse and often contradictory cultures and peoples into a vague, monolithic other. While the impact of Said's work is hard to overstate, Orientalism was published in the late 1970s. Viewing this book and its definition of Orientalism in isolation ignores the nearly 50 years of scholarship and criticism that came afterwards. In media studies, Orientalism Orientalism refers to a stereotypical depiction of usually Asian or North African cultures, especially when those stereotypes are used to indicate that a person, place, or thing is alien or exotic in some way. The term is also sometimes used in Native Hawaiian and other indigenous scholarship to reflect the way that those cultures are also often flattened, stereotyped, and seen as backwards. It's important to note that these stereotypes don't need to be negative to be Orientalist. For example, these dancer outfits are everywhere in anime and video games, and these designs can be compelling, even beautiful, but they're still being used as a shorthand for a distant foreign culture that's as alluring as it is unusual. Octo says early in his video that it's
Important that we understand what that word means and how it's applied to the Gerudo before going any further.
And I agree. Words like Orientalism are helpful because they describe something specific, so it's essential that we're all on the same page about what that specific something is. Unfortunately, this noble pursuit immediately flies out the window when Octo pulls up the Britannica article on Orientalism. This article is not about Orientalism, the academic term we just defined that's been used in media studies and cultural theory for decades. It's predominantly about the 18th and 19th century scholarly discipline, what you might remember as just the first part of the three-part definition we looked at earlier. There's one sentence in this entire article explaining that more recently the term has been used to refer disparagingly to, quote, allegedly simplistic, stereotyped, and demeaning conceptions of Arab and Asian cultures generally held by Western scholars, end quote. But this is pretty reductive, and it doesn't actually help a reader understand what people mean when they call something Orientalist in a media studies context. Again, these stereotypes don't have to be demeaning, they just have to be othering. But Octo goes on to explain that
in the modern day, the term has been commandeered to specifically refer to depictions of Eastern cultures which are considered by some to be problematic.
He says that Edward Said's work began to shift the definition of the word Orientalism towards the way that
many Americans understand the term nowadays,
which he describes as
the problematic and or racist depiction of Islamic and Arabic culture in media.
I want to pause and point out the deliberate choice of words here. The media studies definition of Orientalism isn't presented as the result of the kind of benign linguistic evolution that happens all the time in academia, but as some uniquely American project to commandeer an unrelated word to mean something completely different. But of course, these things aren't unrelated, as the scholarly discipline that Britannica is talking about here is the institution that Said was criticizing, one that sought to invent and represent the East. Even Octo's use of the words Eastern, Islamic, and Arabic to interchangeably refer to the cultures and people of Southwest Asia and North Africa is the exact sort of flattening that Said was talking about. I'm not bringing this up to accuse Octorok reviews of being racist. It's just a good example of how easy it can be to slip into this way of thinking. Octo claims that he's read much of Said's work, but I frankly don't believe him. He only directly quotes Said once, and the quote he uses is found on page 12 of Orientalism. Considering some of the arguments he's about to make in this video, I have no reason to believe he read past the introduction. To finally get back to talking about Zelda though, Octo says that
when some people say that the Gerudo are Orientalist, what they're really saying is that they think the Gerudo are negative or racist depictions of Middle Eastern peoples, and thus advocate for their removal from the series.
We've already established that nobody in the conversation that sparked this video, and indeed nobody I've ever seen, is advocating for the Gerudo to be removed from the Zelda series. But would the Gerudo even need to be negative or racist depictions of Middle Eastern people to be considered Orientalist? No. The real reason the Gerudo are Orientalist is because they borrow from a vague, quote-unquote, Middle Eastern aesthetic specifically to communicate their otherness. One of the weirdest things about Octo's video is that a huge chunk of it is dedicated specifically to defending the Gerudo as they appear in Ocarina of Time, at their least nuanced and most Orientalist. Hell, even his initial tweet praised the Gerudo specifically for their role as a quote-unquote tragic other in Ocarina's story. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with having a character or even a group of characters in a fictional setting that exists to give an outsider's perspective on the society in which the story takes place. The problem arises when that difference is communicated using symbolism loaded with historical and political baggage. If you're not compelled by the argument that this perpetuates harmful ideas about real-world people, at least consider that it's lazy world-building. After all, you don't need to write a fleshed-out group of outsiders if you can just plaster your fictional race with iconography that's historically been used to denote the other. Octo's video actually demonstrates very well how effective this tactic is, because he repeatedly makes claims about the Gerudo that, rather than being rooted in the text of the game, are based on assumptions he makes about them as a result of the tropes and visual language used in their design. Let's start by asking a simple question. What do we know about the Gerudo in Ocarina of Time? The answer is actually not a whole lot. We know they live in the Gerudo Desert at the western edge of Hyrule. We know they're all women, with the exception of one man born every 100 years, who, by law, rules over them as their king. And we know that they're referred to as thieves. That's pretty much all we get in the actual text of the game, but you wouldn't know it by listening to Octo talk about them. According to him, the Gerudo are actually a tragic, misunderstood group of people who only resort to thievery because they live in the desert and have no other choice. Here's the problem. That's fanfiction. Despite the constant references to the Gerudo being thieves, we're never given examples of any of them besides Ganondorf actually stealing anything, let alone any kind of insight into their motivation. Octo says,
"There's both a combination of direct banditry and feminine wild that they utilize to survive. And yes, I do say survive, because the lands they come from are so barren and inhospitable that their theft is, in fact, done out of necessity in most cases. Ocarina of Time makes that rather clear."
But it doesn't. None of what he just said is reflected in the text of Ocarina of Time. Instead, he's making an assumption about what motivates the Gerudo based solely on the fact that they're thieves who live in the desert, which, to be clear, is exactly why the Gerudo are depicted as thieves who live in the desert. Leaning on tropes is an easy way to imply story or character depth without actually having to write it. And I don't think visual shorthand is always a bad thing, but tropes don't exist in a vacuum, and I think it's important to examine the underlying assumptions that they communicate. Yes, there have been plenty of groups throughout history who engaged in raiding or banditry to survive. Pirates, highway robbers, Mongols, Wild West outlaws, and yes, desert nomads have historically popped up in places where valuable trade flowed through, like the Silk Road, or where resources are scarce and there's no real law or centralized control, like on the open ocean. But there's nothing to suggest the Gerudo are a nomadic people. As far as we can tell, they permanently reside in their fortress, and if they're close enough to Hyrule to raid and steal from the people who live there, wouldn't that also mean that they're close enough to Hyrule to engage in trade? There's no shortage of shops and other vendors across Hyrule, but there's no Gerudo shop. Why not? Why are the Gerudo depicted here as less sophisticated than the rock and fish people? The only merchant in the Gerudo Desert is this unnamed barefoot guy with a huge nose who sits cross-legged on a flying carpet and sells you a mysterious item for an upfront payment of 200 rupees, which turns out to just be bomb chews, which usually only cost 100 rupees. The only merchant in the desert is a guy on a flying carpet who scams you! Honestly, I feel like we can end the video here. If you're thinking at this point that there's no way the developers thought that hard about this, I actually agree. I don't think this was done deliberately because Nintendo is racist. I think it was done because these Orientalist tropes have been reproduced so many times that people often don't think twice about including them in their work, which is exactly why it's so important to be thoughtful and to grapple with our own unconscious biases. Octo spends a considerable portion of his video trying to answer the question of whether the Gerudo are even meant to represent real-life Middle Eastern people in the first place. And while one look at their design is enough to lean towards yes, the real answer is that it doesn't actually matter. The Gerudo existing as some non-specific mishmash of various Southwest Asian and North African aesthetics actually strengthens the argument that we're dealing with an Orientalist caricature here. Everything about the Gerudo serves to other them in order to create a juxtaposition between the civilized, prosperous Hyrule and the backwards, alien Gerudo Desert, and that's most apparent in the way the game's villain is characterized. Let's talk about Ganondorf. Ganondorf is branded as an outsider from his very introduction, where he's referred to as a wicked man of the desert. While Wind Waker would go on to flesh out Ganondorf's backstory and motivation, in Ocarina of Time there was no stated reason for his desire to conquer Hyrule. He was just an evil guy doing evil things for evil reasons. Octo himself describes Ganondorf as embodying
the absolute worst of Eastern despotism,
which is funny because I thought the Gerudo Desert was in the West. He must have played the Master Quest. All jokes aside though, isn't this a major self-report? A despot is just a ruler with absolute power. It's a synonym for tyrant, and tyranny isn't confined to any one time period or geographic location. Describing Ganondorf not just as a despot, but an Eastern, dare I say, Oriental despot, is invoking a discursive framework that became popular in 18th century European politics. The philosopher Montesquieu popularized the idea of Oriental despotism not as a straightforward criticism of Eastern civilization, but as a sort of boogeyman representing the dangers posed by absolute monarchy. If you think back to your 10th grade history class, you might remember that Montesquieu was an advocate for institutional limits to prevent a descent into tyranny, most famously expressed in his idea of the separation of powers. The role of the Oriental despot it, then, was to serve as an example of what happens when tyranny goes unchecked. Of course, like all Orientalist fallacies, this flattens and essentializes an entire geographical region, but this idea of Oriental despotism managed to outlive Montesquieu and cement itself into the Western scholarly canon, something Said mentions by name in Chapter 3 of Orientalism. One of the important developments in 19th century Orientalism was the distillation of essential ideas about the Orient, its sensuality, its tendency to despotism, its aberrant mentality, into a separate and unchallenged coherence. Thus, for a writer to use the word Oriental was a reference for the reader sufficient to identify a specific body of information about the Orient. All of this is to say that when Octo says that Ganondorf embodies the absolute worst of Eastern despotism, it's hard not to hear that as a word-for-word invocation of the exact sort of rhetoric Said was criticizing. Octo also points out that Ganondorf
doesn't look anything like a Middle Easterner, Arabic or otherwise.
And side note, Arabic is a language. The word you're looking for is Arab. But anyway, while his final design certainly leans more into fantasy than any real-world inspiration, his concept art looked like this. So do with that what you will. Octo frames the Gerudo, including Ganondorf, as sympathetic products of their environment, but the desert is hardly an innocuous, apolitical choice of backdrop for your society of bandits, and environmental determinism is a hallmark of Orientalism.
Hold on, can we talk about this? The desert thing? The desert is not a barren wasteland where nothing can survive. Sure, from the outside looking in, the desert looks that way. You don't know where the water is, you can't identify the plants that grow there, you don't know what to wear, you don't know how to build your buildings. So it's a wasteland to the outsider. But the desert is not a wasteland. There are areas of the desert which are unlivable, just like there are areas of a lot of biomes that are unlivable. That is why people don't live there. I am not saying that the desert is the easiest place in the world to live, because that would be stupid, but we need to undune the desert. Egypt is not Arrakis. Your oldest ancestors came from the desert. It's somewhere people thrive and have thrived regularly across time, without stealing, without kidnapping, or any other change to their moral fiber. To insist otherwise is deterministic and inaccurate. Octo is so attached to the idea of scarcity in this desert that he says there are no horses when Ganondorf rides a specifically Gerudo stallion. And that's not to mention the sand seals, which also provide transport. I think that they're doing fine. It's really unfortunate then that the moral fiber of people who live in the desert, particularly in North Africa, is cheapened by default, because in the eyes of people who don't understand our politics and don't ever try to, we are humiliated. In Octo's video, he brings up Islamic culture a lot as a contrast to Gerudo. He argues that since Islamic culture is patriarchal and Gerudo society is matriarchal, the Gerudo are not inspired by Southwest Asia and North Africa, as people imply.
The Gerudo are clearly different from real-world Islamic cultures in several ways, the first of which is that they're an inherently matriarchal society. This, obviously, is in complete contrast to the general patriarchal family structures of real-world Middle Eastern peoples.
The thing is, the Gerudo are not a matriarchy. Women are not the default center of power for them in every era of Zelda. The reason for the population's gender imbalance in the first place was not a based woman-only society thing, it was adherence to a harem stereotype. Ganondorf and his fortress, surrounded by beautiful women in harem pants and pointy shoes who are almost all obedient to him regardless of their own feelings on his actions. The only difference is that here, the women carry swords, but the dynamic and basic aesthetics are all there. Now, modern era Zelda feels more matriarchal because Ganondorf just isn't there to rule. He's Calamity Ganon instead, a blight and not a person. And the Gerudo have completely distanced themselves from him. He did destroy the world, maybe because Nintendo got it through their thick skulls that the harem thing was a bad look. If you're focused on Breath of the Wild era Zelda, we are on an upward trajectory, but it's revisionist to ignore the roots of the society and lore, which are about Ganon having a very patriarchal, very stereotypical harem. I am not affirming the idea that so-called Islamic culture is just a unique patriarchal hellscape, and the Gerudo being patriarchal means they are inspired by it, because Harems are not Islamic culture, and patriarchy is a global reality that's difficult to escape. It exists everywhere, and will assert itself through certain manifestations of religion as much as it will through anything else. That's human culture at this point. I want to focus on this conflation of the Middle East with Islamic culture. Conflating these two things is already ridiculous. Even though a lot of the countries in Southwest Asia and North Africa are Muslim majority, the cultures are vastly different. There's a reason why people entrenched in these cultures don't just try to marry any Muslim. They try to marry within their own ethnic group. Marrying outside of it causes cultural tensions. They have different expectations and views and practices because they aren't a monolith, like, at all. But in Octo's video, Islamic culture is conflated with Southwest Asia and North Africa all the time. He mentions harem pants as being, quote,
the stereotypical dress of Muslim women,
and the bare midriff those pants create as
reminiscent of Egyptian provocative dancers of the 19th century.
Which one is it? Because as far as I know, belly dancing is not the paragon of traditional piety. We've fallen into confusion. The only way to fix it is to understand. What is Islamic culture? Octo's attempt at defining it is, well, the example in this video of patriarchy in Islamic culture is not sourced. But there is a New Yorker watermark, so it's pretty easy to look up. The New Yorker Muslims and the Taliban?
The Taliban?
The infamous terrorist organization in Afghanistan is what we are using as reference for the Islamic court. This is not an okay way to represent a globally marginalized group of people. This is not an Islamic court. There is no book of Sharia law that people go to and give verdicts through. This is a discursive tradition. There are typical discussions of jurisprudence. The religion is based on a book, which people interpret and reinterpret through an ever-evolving discourse, which has no central institution. People do it in all sorts of ways, and maybe, just maybe, the way that they practice their religion is a little off the mark because they are part of a terrorist organization. The New Yorker loves to shove a camera in this Osama bin Laden looking ass face so that you can feel okay about it when your country extracts resources from the region, and you are just eating it up and presenting it as Islamic culture, when it's just what's happening in Afghanistan specifically. If you want to learn more about what Sharia actually is, I highly recommend the channel Let's Talk Religion, where a non-Muslim creator has an amazing video explaining Sharia, so that when you hear people talking about it on the news or in videos like this, you'll actually know what it is. A lot of Muslim majority countries have issues with women's rights, but this is not Islam. This is the Taliban. This is the situation in Afghanistan. And the fact that they're being presented as one and the same makes it really hard to even engage. If you wanted to know what Islamic culture was, why is this your source? What's your other depiction in this video? Team America World Police? Describing it as
the most innocuous depictions of human beings,
while these guys walk around saying
Durka Durka, Muhammad Jihad.
There's an element to this which is parodizing Hollywood's racist and Orientalist depiction of Southwest Asia and North Africa, but that feels kind of ephemeral. I guess I wonder what's funny about this scene, if you're against the war on terror, or if you're from one of these countries yourself. Is it really funny enough as just a parody? Or is a part of what you're laughing at the brown guy going,
Bacala, Muhammad Jihad?
There sure are a lot of conservative comments on this movie clip on YouTube. I wonder why. There's this idea in Octo's video, and just in general, that people who criticize Orientalist media have an issue with things being
morally or politically problematic.
How vague. These aren't just political issues for white teenagers to tweet about. We actually play these games, you know? The people being Orientalized. My camel has a portable charger for my Switch. This video claims the Gerudo are a great representation, and this whole discourse is just Western Twitter users whining. Can I whine about what's meant to represent me if it sucks? The visual design, for example, is surface level. and confused. There is nothing wrong with taking inspiration from various cultural sources for fantasy. The problem is that anyone who knows anything about these cultures and histories will immediately recognize it's not coming from a place of knowledge and inspiration and like any research at all. It's boring. Let's take a look at the design of a Gerudo. Octo's video refers to Gerudo across all of the Zelda games, but to be fair to the franchise, I'm gonna look at the most recent iteration. Let's take a look at Riju. Riju's outfit takes inspiration from Egyptian belly dancers. Belly dancing is over-sexualized by the foreign observer, and Breath of the Wild era Zelda is no exception. Link's Vi outfit is made tantalizing through that same midriff-bearing element. No one would bear their midriff out in the desert like this, but it's kinda sexy, so it's what they went with. You might think this is the end of the Egyptian references, but it's not even close. She has a Cleopatra bob in the second game. The symbol of her power is a headdress, the Usek collar. I know you've seen this shape in all ancient Egyptian art ever. I don't even have to explain. These anklets are like khulkhel. Wealthy Egyptian women loved to wear them. So far, it looks pretty Egyptian to me. Certainly more metal than any Egyptian would wear in the desert, but the magical element of the Gerudo is lightning, so there is a fantastical sense to it. And I overlook it because it looks sick. Now let's look at what's on her neck. Riju looks to be wearing African neck rings. These are traditionally given to a wife by her husband and only removed upon his death, which is really funny considering there are no men here. In a fantasy setting, it can take new context, but it's hard when there is nothing else on this design, at least that I can see, which resonates with this visual indicator. There are so many Egyptian things. Throwing in this jewelry from South Ndeble is less cookery and more confusion. Then there's the scimitar, a sword that does not exist. Scimitars are a Western artistic rendition of those swords that are curvy from the East. Which swords? All of them. Shamsir, Saif, Talwar, Nimcha, Kopesh, Kili, Jiatagan. Scimitar is basically the word white people made for, I don't know, I haven't seen that one before. Or in Octo's words,
A Middle Eastern sword, yes! How did you know that?
it is truly remarkable how he is able to be this condescending and this wrong at the same time. And you know what the Scimitar of the Seven looks like? None of these swords. It bears close resemblance to the Chinese cloud-head saber, Yun Todao. Riju's just in a very Chinese time of her life. Why not just take inspiration from the Kopesh? It's an Egyptian curved sword which looks cooler and is less dissonant. Where are the parts of this design which draw on some deeper knowledge of the clothing and create believability? The Egyptian elements are exclusively the visual stereotypes, and the non-Egyptian elements are random. Hey, let's throw some peacock feathers in there, and a gem dangling on her forehead right where a bindi would go. And then on her back and front torso, these petals look like they might be a simplified form from an Indian motif. We're feeling very ethnic. Nobody's perfect at this, but when I'm compelled to take from several cultures for one design, I try to steer away from stereotypes and do as much research as possible, then combine that well-informed niche information into something that is detached from reality while feeling very human. Or I'll use one culture as a base, research it well so it's grounded. Then when I integrate some inspiration from other cultures, it feels less like I'm throwing cliches into a blender. There will be visual stereotypes involved, but not this much. Just not this much. So, to review, as an Egyptian, I'm supposed to gloss over the persistently fetishistic designs, and according to Octo, I'm also supposed to forget the racist initial release of Ocarina of Time, the weird chant in the Goron Fire Temple with some religiously significant Arabic words thrown in, garbled, the Gerudo symbols being the crescent and star. Yes, those details were changed, but they make it clear that things have been rotten from the start. While their modern appearances are less egregious, it does not feel like they have really re-researched or revisited the Gerudo with a cultured eye since. I just think that maybe they can tweak the design a bit, and hopefully we, the collective we, can be a little bit more normal about the desert and the desert people, because as one of them, I love the Gerudo. And at the same time, this feels not good. I feel like we can push for a better version. Back to you, Skitty.
Thank you. A point that Octo repeatedly raises throughout his video, as well as in the comments of his video, is that the Gerudo can't be Orientalist caricatures because the people making the game are
fucking Japanese.
There's a moment in his video that is genuinely offensive, not because it's bigoted in some way, but because of how intellectually dishonest and incurious it is. It's a little long, but I don't want to be accused of taking him out of context, so just sit tight for a minute, alright? Roll the clip.
Intent mattered very little to Said, because in many cases, Oriental studies were both informative and respectful. Said himself lists several key examples, such as Edward William Lane's account of the manners and customs of the modern Egyptians. But because the summation of all these works existed within the context of colonial domination over the Near East, and oftentimes were used to justify said domination, the ultimate purpose and end goal of Oriental studies was, in Said's conclusion, a way to stigmatize, otherize, and dominate the Near East from a Western perspective. Alright, so with all of that out of the way, there's now an obvious question we need to ask ourselves at this point. What the fuck does any of that have to do with a fantasy video game made by Japanese people in the year 1998? It's not that Orientalism or colonial stereotypes are impossible for Japanese people to participate in. See Kimba the White Lion and all of its blatant racism against both Africans and Middle Easterners is a prime example, but how does that have anything to do with the Gerudo? The idea seems to be that because the Gerudo have aspects of their culture dictated by Middle Eastern elements, and because said culture stands in contrast to Hylian society, that it is therefore Orientalist. But Orientalism doesn't automatically equal bad. Like I said, modern Middle Eastern studies are literally just Orientalism with some rebranding attached to it.
What the fuck does any of that have to do with a fantasy video game made by Japanese people, and how does that have anything to do with the Gerudo are rhetorical questions. The conclusion Octo is counting on the viewer reaching is that the answer is, it doesn't. He's even got the silly Malomart theme playing in the background to emphasize how ridiculous it is to assert that the framework of Orientalism applies to the Gerudo at all. But why? He grants that Japanese media can include racist or Orientalist caricatures, but then dismisses out of hand the idea that the Gerudo could be an example of that phenomenon. He then pivots from, it's not that Orientalism is impossible for Japanese people to participate in, while discussing Kimba the White Lion, to Orientalism doesn't automatically equal bad, it's just Middle Eastern studies rebranded when talking about the Gerudo. It's obvious from this little sleight of hand that Octo actually does grasp the difference between the Britannica definition of Orientalism and the media studies definition of Orientalism. He's just pretending that he doesn't. He also says that the Gerudo have aspects of their culture dictated by Middle Eastern elements, but like, what does that even mean? If he's talking about their veils, curved blades, pointy shoes, bare midriffs, and baggy pants, those aren't Middle Eastern elements, they're costume pieces specifically chosen to highlight their otherness. It's worth noting that Octo's jumping here between footage of the Ocarina of Time Gerudo and the Wild Era Gerudo, which just strikes me as dishonest. Like, they're not equally problematic. The Wild Era Gerudo certainly aren't perfect, but they're a huge improvement from their appearance in Ocarina of Time. Octo needs you to believe that this is the argument his unreasonable opposition is making, because if he admits that the actual comparison looks more like this, his entire charade falls apart. But okay, let's rewind a little. Let's pretend he didn't bring up Kimba, thus tacitly admitting that Nintendo being Japanese doesn't actually have any bearing on their capacity to reproduce Orientalist tropes. For starters, the Zelda series has been steeped in the aesthetic of Western medieval fantasy since its inception, whether as a result of the Westernization that began to take hold in Japan in the Meiji period, a deliberate attempt to market to the Western audience that has always been responsible for the overwhelming majority of the Zelda series sales, or both. In the first Legend of Zelda game, Link had a cross on his shield, and the Book of Magic was straight up called the Bible in the Japanese version. Zelda 2 featured a cross as an obtainable item. A Link to the Past was the first game in the series to move towards an in-universe religion, introducing the Golden Goddesses and emphasizing the Triforce as a symbol of worship, but an official piece of concept art for the game featured Link kneeling in front of a crucifix. With all of this context, is it really so nonsensical to see Ocarina of Time's Ganondorf, a wicked man of the desert who seeks to conquer the Holy Land, the Sacred Realm, with his harem at his back, and be reminded of the imagery associated with European colonial domination? I don't think so. Speaking of European imagery, you might argue that it's hypocritical to take issue with the way the Gerudo are depicted, but not with the European-inspired Hylians. And to that, I'd urge you to look at the difference in how the two groups are presented. Hylian characters are treated as the default humans, with most of them having unique character models and distinct personalities. The Gerudo, on the other hand, are treated as perpetual outsiders who, with the exception of Ganondorf, his mothers, and Nabooru, share the same 3 character models. Not only are they treated as interchangeable, they're the only human characters Link can attack, and you can even borrow a Gerudo mask at the Happy Mask Shop, prompting certain characters to cry out in fear or tell you how much they hate Gerudos. Octo also compares the Gerudo to the Sheikah, who, at least in the Wild era, are based on Japanese people. He initially did this in the Twitter argument that sparked this whole thing, disingenuously asking if the Sheikah being depicted as different from the Hylians meant that the developers were being racist against themselves. Friend of the channel Boobly said that even if the Sheikah were a racist caricature, that wouldn't make the depiction of the Gerudo any less problematic. And I think Octo had a reading comprehension failure here, because he interpreted this tweet as Boobly calling the developers racist for their depiction of the Sheikah, which he wasn't, and also the Sheikah aren't a racist caricature. The Sheikah are depicted as different from the Hylians, sure, but they're also by far the most important people in the story of Breath of the Wild. Without them, Link would have no Shrine of Resurrection to be revived in, no Sheikah Slate to guide him, no towers to climb, no divine beasts to free, and so on and so forth. He, and by extension the player, are reliant on the Sheikah throughout the entirety of their journey. While the Sheikah have a complete alphabet that's one-to-one with English letters, the written Gerudo language is much more limited, and the spoken Gerudo language is even worse. First of all, the Gerudo are the only people in the game who speak a foreign language to begin with. Second of all, the Gerudo words Savak, Sabsaba, Savor, Vasak, and Savork, meaning good day, good evening, good night, welcome, and goodbye, respectively, all derive from the Japanese word Sabaku, meaning desert. Savota, which means good morning, comes from the Japanese word Saboten, meaning cactus. They made the Gerudo speak a language that literally translates to desert, cactus. You can't make this shit up. So while yes, the Sheikah are outsiders, they're not othered in the same way as the Gerudo. As Lawrence Herfs wrote in Dreams of the Japanese Self in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild,
grounded within the historical complexity surrounding Japan's desires to at once align with and be separate from the West, the Gerudo thus emerge as something of an uber-other, an amalgamation of Orientalisms in which the Western and Japanese gaze unite.
One last thing about the whole Nintendo is Japanese argument. When assessing the Gerudo to try and figure out whether or not they're meant to represent real-world Middle Eastern people, Octo calls out their bright red hair as something that
throws that comparison off a bit.
But that got me thinking, why do the Gerudo have red hair? A possible explanation dates all the way back to the year 1600 when the Dutch first arrived in Japan. Yes, really. For over 200 years, the only foreigners allowed to visit Japan were Dutch traders who were known as Komojin, or literally red-haired people. In her discussion of Japanese depictions of the other in Soul Calibur, Rachel Hutchinson points out that the non-Japanese Asian characters are often given red hair, and posits that that aesthetic choice is meant to signify otherness. It's not impossible that a similar logic led to the Gerudo all sporting red hair as well. Finally, before we move on, I want to focus on the fantasy defense Octo repeatedly brings up. When he responds to the part of my tweet where I criticize the Gerudo all bearing their midriff, playing into the exotic belly dancer stereotype, he says that
the midriff thing is absolutely intentional. Yes, the Gerudo sexualize themselves on purpose because they're trying to attract men from other tribes. That's literally what the survival of their entire species is predicated on.
As an aside, referring to the Gerudo as a separate species from the other human characters is absolutely rancid, but doing our best to put that aside, no, the Gerudo do not sexualize themselves on purpose because they aren't real. They're characters in a video game that were created by humans, just like you and me. This is what Dan Olson called the diegetic or Thermian argument, an argument that aims to dismiss criticism at its core,
suggesting that there aren't any problems with the text provided controversial elements are internally consistent with the rest of the story world.
These arguments ignore the fact that what we think of as the canon of a fictional world exists as a result of an author writing it that way. The Gerudo sexualizing themselves is not a matter of historical fact, and treating it as such is intellectually dishonest. Moreover, yet again, this is not an actual analysis of the text. It's not stated anywhere in any of the games that the Gerudo wear these stereotypical costumes specifically to attract men, and if that were true, it would be even more weird and gross than it already is to put all of the Gerudo children in that same outfit. Hold on, editing skitty here. Something I've neglected to mention so far is how fucking creepy this video is. We've mentioned Octo ignoring the text of the game to write fanfiction about the Gerudo a few times now, but the first time he does it is arguably the most egregious. He asserts near the beginning of the video that the Gerudo steal
high-value goods like horses and men. Yes, men. Because these women only give birth to a single man once every 100 years, the only way they can continue to reproduce in the interim is by taking men from other tribes, in this case the Hylians, and using them to, well, you know.
First of all, this isn't even the first time he's put cropped porn of Riju in his videos. He also puts it in his Wind Waker review where he reiterates this exact claim.
And the Gerudo decided to kidnap Link for, biological reasons.
And just to be crystal clear, it is never stated anywhere in Ocarina of Time that the Gerudo kidnap men in order to sexually assault them so they can reproduce. The only time we hear about Gerudo women taking Hylian partners is when talking to this Gossip Stone, which says that they sometimes come to Castletown to look for boyfriends. This doesn't imply anything non-consensual, and Octo never even brings this line of dialogue up. He just saw the Gerudo locking Link and the Carpenters up in jail and then wrote his script with one hand. Same goes for when he says that the Gerudo consider men to be
useless for anything other than breeding.
This is something he's imagining that's not in the text of the game. He says both in this video and in his Ocarina of Time review that the Gerudo section of the game is
meant to explore Link's developing sexuality as he grows into adulthood.
And like, let's ignore the fact that he's just repeating a part of that one Good Blood video out of context and mangling it. Let's even ignore the fact that Link is a child in an adult's body here, and that the events of Ocarina of Time are so traumatic that they lead to Majora's Mask happening. The idea that Link travels to the desert to have some sort of sexual awakening is, surprise, something Edward Said talks about at the end of Chapter 2 of Orientalism. When discussing Gustave Flaubert's body of work, Said says that sex in European society, quote, entailed a web of legal, moral, even political and economic obligations of a detailed and certainly encumbering sort. And as such, quote again, the Orient was a place where one could look for sexual experience unobtainable in Europe. So the idea of a journey to a distant desert land where you have some liberating sexual awakening is, again, an example of Orientalism. I initially cut this part out of the video for brevity, but considering this video is going to be almost an hour long anyway, it felt too important to omit. Alright, back to past me. Taking everything we've talked about so far into account, you might be coming away with the impression that Octorok Reviews is simply ignorant. Sure, he doesn't argue his points well, he isn't doing any kind of close reading of the text of the games, he didn't appear to do any kind of in-depth research, and he doesn't even seem to understand what Orientalism is, but so what? Why spend all this time researching, writing, and editing this video just to clap back at some guy who's clearly out of his depth? Well, I don't actually think Octo is stupid. I don't think he's some well-meaning guy who just rushed out a bad video without knowing any better. Let's take a closer look at some choice moments from this video, as well as his comments under this video, that I think are helpful in trying to answer my most pressing question, which is, what is this really about? Throughout this video, Octo does his best to portray himself as a neutral, open-minded intellectual who's just trying to understand this unreasonable horde of Zelda fans who insist on censoring and retconning his beloved series solely to fulfill their own need to morally grandstand. He's so committed to portraying his ideological opponents as irrational that he poisons the well right off the bat, saying that his video isn't made for those people since
they've doubtless already made up their minds and likely aren't willing to listen to reason at this point.
This framing is essential because if you look at the wider picture of the incident that inspired this video and see that, in fact, it was him who opted to pick a fight under a post that wasn't even primarily about the Gerudo, and certainly didn't call for their removal, it makes him look like he's just throwing a tantrum over the idea of a conversation nobody was actually having. The complete unwillingness to engage with what his opposition actually believes is best embodied by this moment where he throws up the reception section of the article for the Gerudo on Wikipedia, with text reading,
"Some insane motherfucker on Wikipedia wrote a whole essay summarizing the bullshit views of games journalists who've complained about this shit over the years. I've seen actual articles of major historical events with less detail written on them on Wikipedia and the Gerudo article. Holy shit."
Now, I've been online and embroiled in culture war bullshit for long enough to know that if someone is complaining about games journalists and they're not talking about the Cuphead tutorial, 99 times out of 100, it's unsubstantiated ideological grievance. And it's hard not to feel like this is an example of that. He smears the multitude of different opinions and perspectives that appear here as bullshit opinions without ever explaining what exactly he takes issue with. The articles by Lawrence Hurst and Byron J. Kimball in particular stand out because those authors aren't journalists, they're academics. I've actually had both of these papers downloaded on my laptop since 2024 since I thought I might end up using them for a school project that never panned out. I cited Hurst in this video, and both papers were part of the research that went into making it. Octo's dismissive attitude towards any contemporary scholarship is striking in how immature and reactionary it is. If this video actually sought to engage in good faith with people who believe Orientalism in Zelda is a real issue, academic journals published on that very topic would be the first place I'd look. Even the shred of respect he pretends to have for Said's work falls apart in the comments where he refers to the work of his contemporaries as drivel, cooked up by some starving intellectual from the 70s. In another comment, he drops the civility thing altogether, casting his interlocutors as Twitter freaks and saying,
"So help me God, I will expunge this rot from the Zelda fandom, one overly analytical video at at a time.
All the work he put in to make himself seem neutral in the video itself goes out the window here, as he lays out what I already suspected was the purpose of this video. He wants to make discussion of social issues in gaming spaces impossible, which is funny because as it stands, Twitter is hardly a bastion of progressivism. It's not like every time you draw fan art of Link wearing the Gerudo Vi outfit you get swarmed by blue-haired feminists chucking copies of Orientalism at you. On the contrary, when Bea Silent Princess made a thread a couple years ago criticizing that very outfit, she was inundated with hate comments. There aren't any big YouTubers that have talked about this issue in any amount of detail, there's not some big movement to cancel the Gerudo, and the position that people who criticize these things are overly sensitive, ridiculous, or contemptible is already the dominant one. All this video does is revel in some imagined victimization at the hands of a tiny minority of Zelda fans who, and I can't stress this enough, still love and care about the Zelda series. I don't believe for a second that Octo blacked out my username and profile picture to protect my identity or to prevent harassment, especially because if that's true, his decision to not censor the profile pictures of the other people involved in that conversation is irresponsible at best. I think he needed to keep me anonymous because revealing that this unreasonable fake Zelda fan who only criticizes these games in service of ideological virtue signaling is actually skitty fucking bitty would make him look even more like a gormless weirdo than he already does. I should note that Octo's been cordial, even friendly in our public interactions, but it doesn't feel sincere. If anything, I'm waiting for him to turn around after this video comes out and talk about how all this is so uncalled for and he's only ever been nice to me, which is kind of hard to square with this whole video that misrepresents what I believe and his expunge this rot from the Zelda fandom line. Back to the video itself though, because there's one more moment I wanted to focus on. In service of keeping up his veneer of neutrality or even faux progressivism, Octo talks repeatedly about how the Gerudo add diversity to the series. But in one of these instances near the end of the video, he lets his mask slip a little bit, and it's basically all downhill from there. Let's watch the clip.
These are positive, strong, female role models who all come from the same tribe of people, and they are beloved characters, not just because of their good writing, but also, and I admit this is less important to me, but it is important to others, which I respect, they add diversity to a game series that otherwise is centered around European-looking characters. I'm really not sure what these people envision the Zelda series looking like without its current world-building structure, but if it's anything like the fantasy slop we see on TV these days, where every cast of characters look like they came straight out of LA, then they're making a big mistake. What you have with a series like Zelda or The Elder Scrolls is a fantasy story with dynamic, proper representation. You can have women of color appear in your European-based fantasy story if you take the time to write a group of people with an interesting history and culture that fits into that world perfectly.
Okay, so first off, I appreciate him giving us the disclaimer that he doesn't care about diversity and that he's strictly using that concept for point scoring. He says he's not sure what these people envision Zelda looking like without its current world-building structure, but the world-building in the Zelda series is famously inconsistent. As an aside, it's a belief of mine that world-building is, in general, overrated. I think the themes and characters in a story matter way more than any sort of realism or internal consistency, but I digress. His comment about the fantasy slop we see on TV these days, where every cast of characters looks like they came straight out of LA, is where things get really nasty. I've been trying to come up with a charitable explanation for this line, especially in the context of him discussing diversity and paired with the visual he chose to accompany it, but I just can't. This isn't a criticism of said quote-unquote fantasy slop being boring or poorly written. It's him complaining that he saw a black person in a genre where he feels they don't belong. His comparison to Zelda, where he says, you can have women of color appear in your European-based fantasy story if you take the time to write a group of people with an interesting history and culture, is proof that he sees the presence of women of color in a fantasy story as something that needs to be justified, even though Hyrule is not actually Europe. And things like realism and historical accuracy are clearly not the Zelda series' priority. Do I think Octorok Reviews is racist? I don't know. I can't say for certain what's in his heart of hearts, but his attitude is that of someone who, at the very least, sees whiteness as the default, is what I originally wrote, but Octo has recently partnered up with a tea company called The Dragon's Treasure. Here are just some of the things this guy is elected to post on his brand account, and when pressed, he doubled down, saying he stands by everything he's posted. I don't want to litigate petty Twitter drama in this video about Orientalism, but this stuff is too disturbing to ignore, and Octo's refusal to acknowledge, let alone condemn, any of the vile things this guy has publicly said on the Twitter account for the brand he's affiliated with speaks volumes. Then again, he posts shit like this, and this, and this, and he seems to be a big fan of Asmongold, even using clips from him in his tea ad. I wonder what Asmongold thinks about Southwest Asian people.
They are not the same as us. They come from an inferior culture that is horrible. It kills people for their identity. and it is directly antithetical to everything Western values stand for, and it is an inferior culture in all ways.
Ah, I see. Combine all of this with his weird insistence on referring to the player as he in every single one of his Zelda essays, his weird fixation on Riju, and his terminal VTuber brain rot, and my conclusion is simply that Octo is nothing more than your average dime-a-dozen internet reactionary. Is it possible I misunderstood him? Sure, I suppose anything is possible, but with how consistently disingenuous he's been, I'd need to see a lot of evidence to the contrary. But I've already talked about Octo for too long, so let's move on and get this video wrapped up. Okay, so, I don't want to see the Gerudo removed from the Zelda series, but I still take issue with some aspects of how they're depicted. The obvious question is what my solution would be to those issues, and luckily I have a number of different answers. First, it's important to acknowledge that the Gerudo have already come a long way. The Gerudo in the Wild era stand head and shoulders above their counterparts in the N64, both literally and figuratively. I think the increased variety of hairstyles, skin tones, and face shapes is a step in the right direction, and it's especially nice to see Gerudo out-traveling the world. I also appreciate the Gerudo's appearance in Echoes of Wisdom, something Octo doesn't even mention in his video. The Gerudo in Echoes of Wisdom are basically just doing their own thing. They're concerned about the rifts, same as everyone else, and they're not singled out or treated with suspicion. They still wear the stereotypical outfits, and Zelda herself can wear one too, but on the whole it's still an improvement. I also appreciate the continuity between Rotana in the Wild era games and Torma in Echoes of Wisdom. Math, science, and medicine as we know it wouldn't be the same without contributions of scholars like Ibn Sina and Al-Khwarizmi, so it's really cool to see the beginnings of a pattern of Gerudo characters who have a passion for research. In terms of changes I would advise making, let's start with the outfits. The pointy shoes and crop tops have got to go. No one in their right mind would be showing this much skin under the blazing desert sun, and there's no way Riju is doing all of that in heels. Instead of randomly choosing costume pieces from a slew of different cultures, focus on one to ground your inspiration in, and actually do the necessary research to depict it accurately. The same goes for their weapons and other accessories. I would offer more suggestions, but the truth is that I actually don't know how to best represent these cultures. Luckily, Southwest Asian and North African people are capable of representing themselves. Miyamoto visited a horseback riding club during the development of Ocarina of Time to make Epona feel more like a real horse. It's easy to imagine the developers reaching out to artists, architects, and costume designers from the cultures they're hoping to borrow from and learning how to do so accurately and respectfully. The last thing I want to say is just that I think it's ridiculous that this conversation was ever about censorship or shutting down something deemed morally or politically problematic. This video gave me an opportunity to work with some really cool people, to do a lot of fascinating research, and to just generally broaden my horizons. I can't imagine being so close-minded that you take issue with someone interrogating works of art that they care about. Thinking about things critically and researching things you have questions about is one of the most important skills you can develop right now. Anti-intellectualism is everywhere in this day and age, and it's important to resist it whenever possible. Read books, talk to people who know more than you, do your best to grow beyond your comfort zone, because that's all we have. If you take nothing else away from this video, let it be that. Thanks so much for watching this video. First and foremost, I want to thank Sealisms for their contribution to this essay. I loved getting to work together, and us becoming closer friends was by far the best thing to come out of all this. This video was brought to you by my patrons. Thank you so much, everyone. Now that I'm finished with this, it's back to work on the Breath of the Wild video. I want to make it clear that this video wasn't a comprehensive look at the Gerudo or at the issue of Orientalism in the Zelda series, but I hope it at least taught you something new. I'd like to revisit this topic in the future, especially since we didn't even really talk about gender as it pertains to the Gerudo, but for now, I have another giant video to work on. Finally, just to reiterate, do not harass Octorok reviews. I do not condone that behavior, and people who engage in it are not welcome in my community. And if that isn't enough to dissuade you, consider that you're unlikely to actually hurt his feelings. Instead, he'll point to your mean comments as proof that the woke left is trying to cancel him or whatever. Don't give him ammo. Oh, except for Boobly. He's allowed to do whatever he wants. Thank you again to Sealisms for joining me, and thank you so much for watching.